Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Chairman Jorken and Google for having me out. I'm incredibly excited to see all of these leaders and needle movers thinking about all this new innovation. I have been told by a British friend's mum that I speak a bit too much like an overexcited American, so I'll try to tamp my excitement down for those who have to listen to me. And yes, it's just this one right here. Lovely. I'm just going to make sure that you guys can see that. Okay, great. Beautiful. So I've heard a lot of really great talks today, a lot of people talking about the future and what it's going to look like when we have this data-driven society. But I think it's always important to frame this conversation around how much data has already touched everyone's lives here. And it's pretty easy to see if you just think about the last time that you took a trip. So I would ask how many people who took a trip recently, how many of you looked up directions? No, everyone knows where they're going? Okay, awesome. Yeah, that's sort of what I'd expect. And now raise your hand again if you used one of these, an old road map. A couple, okay, some stalwarts. Good, we'll talk later about VHS tapes. Awesome. So this feels a little bit to me like ancient technology. So quickly this seems outdated that there was a time when we would have to figure out where to go and we didn't know which route was best, we didn't know what traffic was going to be like, we had to try to fold that back up. It was a terrible time for humanity. But of course, now we live in a world where we have Google Maps. Ooh, with just a click of a button I can tell how to get from A to B. I know the best route to take and I can make a better decision about how to travel. And this is, of course, because Google Maps is using tons of data, right? It's using weather data, traffic data, historical data, information that lets it crunch down all the possible options, give you the best decision. And these data-driven decisions drive all of our lives in many ways. It's not just how Google tells us where to go, it's how Netflix tells us what we want to watch. It's how Amazon suggests products that we might want to buy. It's even how Facebook tells us who we might want to connect with, who our friend circles are. And as has been brought up many times today, this is because now we no longer just interact with each other in a bubble. We interact with each other and with our world with a computer, a cell phone, something digital in between, an intermediary that allows us to capture this data and make sense of our world. But I don't want to talk just about that again. We've heard a lot about that today. I want to talk about someone who hasn't been mentioned as much today. These guys, data scientists. Call them statisticians, analysts, whatever you call them. These are the guys that know how to take that data and make sense of it. They're the ones building these tools that help us make better decisions every day. And one of the really cool things about these guys is they don't just work on data 9 to 5. No, these guys are working on side projects at night, on their weekends. They'll even do things called hackathons. And I'm curious, how many people in this audience know what a hackathon is? Oh man, that's awesome. I am so happy every time I give this talk that number goes up. So things are working. That's great. So for the uninitiated, a hackathon is a weekend event, a 24-hour period where software engineers, hackers, scientists, they all get together and they just see what cool stuff they can come up with. They just see what can we build in 24 hours. And I'm a data scientist myself. I was thrilled to go to my first hackathon. Because here I was in this room. I know that sounds nerdy. I own it. It's fine. But imagine this scene. Imagine being in this room with these people who are PhDs in machine learning. They have the most advanced programming skills, the most intense statistical knowledge. I thought, this is great. This is how we're going to make the data-driven society. I can't wait to see what we're going to build. It's going to be so transformative. The stuff we're going to build is going to have so much impact. It's going to change the world. And the stuff that we built was so unfulfilling. I mean, here's an app to help you park your car. Here's something that does local deals. And I mean, these are great apps. I use these apps all the time, but they're apps that make super comfortable lives just a tiny bit more comfortable. And it feels like if we have all this capacity, all this new data, new computing, new statistical thinking, we should be using it for more than just making sure that when you guys leave here today, you know exactly where to go to get the best deal on an iPad. It doesn't really help to me that that feels like that really improves the world all that much. I hear what you're saying. Okay, Jake, that's a straw man. What about what governments are doing? Look at how the US government opened up all of its data, or a lot of its data, and is now having hackathons at the White House. You can go improve society with government data. But there's a problem there. And that's if you give a 24-year-old a data set and ask them to solve a problem, they're going to solve their own problems. As a 24-year-old, I'm more interested in where to park my car than how to improve low-income housing or improve the environment. It's just how it goes, and so you'll actually see a lot of the same results. One of the big things that came out of a recent hackathon in New York that was meant to improve sustainability was that a bunch of people built a farmer's market item app. So I know exactly where to go to get kale. That's how the city's data was used. That's not their fault, right? I'm not an expert in poverty. I'm not an expert in environment. That's what you expect to see. So let's switch the tables. Let's go look at some other people who are trying to make the world a better place. The third sector, charities, nonprofits. These guys have missions to make the world a better place. And here's the really cool thing. For the first time in a long time, there's suddenly awash in data. That's one of the cool things to me about big data, is that big means expansive. Everyone is touched by this because of cell phones, because of surveys, because of the datafication of our world. And so take these guys, for example, a clean water NGO, brings clean water to people in Africa. You might be surprised to find they have tons of data. They have data about surveys that they take. They have data about well locations that people put up there. They have data about their finances. And even if they didn't collect a single piece of data, there's third-party data from governments. The World Bank has opened its data. There's all this data that they could use to crunch down and make those same decisions that we did to figure out how to watch movies. So it's so exciting because these guys can bring about data-driven innovation. They can create a data-driven society. And yet for all of this data and excitement, no one is looking at it. And understandably, nonprofits don't have the resources to hire a data scientist. You heard John say it's the sexiest job of the 21st century. Well, that means that you have to pay sexy money for that, too. It's very hard, especially for Greenpeace, or a small nonprofit. So, find ourselves in this very interesting situation where we have experts in data technology sitting around, messing around with it in their spare time, but not a lot of social outputs for it. Governments with vast resources, huge amounts of data that they could deploy to big problems, but no one's quite sure what to put it towards or how to use it. And social organizations with fantastic causes making the world a better place, but no idea what to do with data. So I hope you're all asking the same question that we were asking. Can we just get these guys together? And that is exactly what we do at Datakind. We are a nonprofit that connects pro bono data scientists with governments, foundations, small nonprofits to help better use data to make more effective use of social change. And we think of ourselves as a mobile R&D unit. So we'll come in and do anything with data, not just sort of your measurement and evaluation or impact measurement, but look at data strategy. What other data sources are out there? Data visualization. How can people use data to make better decisions? Because for all of this talk about open data and getting data out there, which is a very important first step, you still need to know what to do with it. Otherwise, it's a lot like crude oil, right? So if you don't know how to refine it, then what? So this is an exciting project we've been working on, and the hope is that by bridging these communities, really bringing about partnerships, you'll give data scientists a chance to have more of an impact. You give social organizations a chance to maximize their impact, and in the process, we'll all get to live in a better world. So let me show you a few examples of what this looks like before I close. The first comes from a fantastic group, some of you may know, called the UN Global Pulse. They're under the UN Secretary General. Their job is to collect huge amounts of data from around the world. And they did a study on global well-being, global happiness. They asked everyone by cell phone, how happy are you? It's a fantastic feat for mobile technology. They asked the world by cell phone how happy they were, and they answered. You could just call up the world now. That's awesome. And that's really exciting. You could probably learn a lot from that until you remember that all that data looks like this. That's data, just to remind you. And if you are a very small group like the UN Global Pulse, how do you go from this to making sense of anything? In fact, they didn't even have answers to some of the most basic questions, like, where did people respond from? Was it all in Chad or across India? We have no idea. I don't know how many people in this room would know how to go from this to that. So what do? Well, you team up with people like this. This is Adam Lycano, who works at Tumblr, Anna Smith, who works at Bitly, and they and a team of volunteers got together with the UN and said, can we even answer that first question of where people responded from? And spending a weekend together, they took this data and turned it instead, into this. This is going to show up any second. Now, this is just a small thing, but it's a visualization showing where people responded over time to this survey. And it was very instrumental for the UN Global Pulse to see this and say, wow, even though this is a very simple visualization, we can start to see things that we couldn't see in this data. We can see how our program actually started across in South Africa and India at first, places that they weren't sure exactly where they were getting coverage. So they got to really understand this data in ways they couldn't before. And more than be able to answer that question, it allowed them to ask questions. I'll play this again just so you can see that as they were watching this, they were trying to understand why they didn't get the penetration in certain places in Eastern Europe that they'd expected to. And you could look at this in a pie chart. You could look at this some other way. But it was this element of seeing it live that really struck a chord with them. To be able to interact with this data was so important, they presented it to the UN General Assembly to say, this is how we have to start thinking about development. We have to have data involved. I'll tell you about another example. It's a little closer to home for me. The New York City Parks Department. They're a city agency. So here's a government agency. They have data about every tree in New York City, what it was, when it was planted, what's ever happened to it. And they said, we've got all this data, but all we do is ever create reports with it. We can't really even answer questions. They wanted to answer some basic questions like, what will our tree population look like in 5 years? Which areas are most susceptible to storm risk? Are our programs even working? So again, they came in teamed with volunteers that are data analysts, strategists, data scientists, and they built a number of great solutions, one of which I'll show here is called Canopy. And Canopy is an interactive tool that lets the New York Parks Department actually drill into the locations of every species of tree that they have. Now, it's a very simple tool just like that. It's a sort of visual inventory. But beyond that, they've been able to do analysis to start to say, what will the population look like in the future? It's actually sort of funny that they confess that when they plant trees, a lot of times it just depends on what trees they have on the truck. So there's not really a larger term strategy as to how this is going to go, but now they can start to look at that. And I put this up because it's visual and it's a talk and you want to look at something visual. But I actually think one of the more important studies that came out of this was looking at risks of areas in New York at risk from storms. And from this, they found which areas were most susceptible to a lot of damage from storms. And this is very coincidental because it was months before Hurricane Sandy hit. And after that, they were actually able to go back and look at these models and say, wow, this actually was fairly accurate. There were a few places that were off. And so they're now using that data to reevaluate for the next one. So they're more prepared and can get people there in advance. So that's cool, right? So big organizations like the Global Pulse teaming with data scientists. Local government teaming with data scientists. Awesome. And lastly, I'll leave you with this last example of a very small nonprofit in India called Mobilizing Health. Now, the problem is if you live in rural India, you may be a long walk to a hospital, maybe a week. So a lot of people die of very preventable diseases. So Mobilizing Health's solution is to put a cell phone in every community health worker's hands in your town. So I may not be able to get to a hospital in an industrial region, but I can go to my local health worker and ask them my symptoms, and they can text it into a doctor. The nice thing about using cell phones is you get really nice data. And so this group actually ended up working with data scientists to understand their own practices. But beyond that, they started to notice trends in that underlying data. They started to see trends of what doctors were prescribing over time. And they even started to see beginning trends of early outbreaks. So this beautiful data wasn't just for the use of improving that little nonprofit itself. It was a new source of data that could be used by groups like the CDC, things like that. So I think I'm running you guys up against time. So I just want to close by saying a couple of observations that might feed into this panel. One is that everything I showed you was done by volunteers in just 24 hours. In 24 hours, that's crazy, right? So it's exciting to see that when people have these skills that team up with the groups that have the data, a lot of really exciting things can happen. The other thing I'll say is that we're seeing groups actually change the way that they operate. We're seeing companies start to hire data scientists, become data-driven. I think that's very exciting. And I want to jump ahead to just one or two really important points that I think feed into today's discussion from these projects that we've seen. One that's really important that I just have to impart here is that data won't ask questions. And I think that's a really important point because a lot of people seem to think of data as a magic bullet. In fact, the biggest request we get is, we have a lot of data. What do we do with it? And our response is always, well, what do you want to know? If you don't have someone around that knows the questions to ask or at least how to evaluate the answers, data is kind of useless. So I'd like to see more thought about getting the subject matter experts and the data scientists in together. And I think there's also a second interpretation of this, which is that data sort of won't tell you where it came from. I think the first thing that data scientists often do is given a data set, jump in and start analyzing. But there are intense technological, social, and political biases tied up in that data. We've dealt with human rights data. And it's very interesting and enticing to jump in and start looking at arrest records. But the question becomes, why was that data collected? By who? If someone's given a race, who decided the race categories? What's the taxonomy of that? And none of that comes with your data when you just click download. I think that's very important. And very lastly, I'll close by saying, we're seeing a change in the way science is done, the way data works. The silos are breaking down. I didn't say that a big company like Facebook teamed up with the UN and some other partners to do this big project. No, it was volunteers from tech companies. It was some visionary people at nonprofits getting together in a basement over a weekend. That's very exciting. And to me, that is sort of emblematic of what we're seeing here today. Of all these people coming together and forming partnerships to do really great things. So I look forward to forming those partnerships with everyone here, and I hope that if you're excited about this, be you a data scientist, foundation person, or government people, that you'll continue the conversation with us to see how we can all get together to use data for more than just figuring out what kind of movies we want to see, and more for figuring out what kind of a world we want to see. Thank you.